Missouri has never been a blue blood in college football. Gary Pinkel brought highs to the program, which included back-to-back SEC championship appearances in 2013 and 2014. When he had to retire due to getting cancer, many thought that Missouri football would stay on the same trajectory and that Barry Odom was going to be the guy to continue the success. Mizzou football was a program branded on hard work, talent development, and finding those players who kind of sneak through the cracks. Barry Odom had similar ranked recruiting classes to Gary Pinkel, but unfortunately, he could never get the job done. He lost a ton of big games, missed out on all the big targets in recruiting in the state, and continually let the fan base down. He was fired after the 2019 season, and they hired up-and-coming head coach Elijah Drinkwitz. He was a young offensive mastermind with a quirky personality and someone who had sold a vision to big-time recruits. So far, it looks like Drinkwitz is going to sign the best class in Missouri football history, and the Mizzou program was on the uptick after a 5-5 record in the 2020 season. Many expected Missouri to be a breakout team in 2021. Some thought they could be as high as third in the SEC East, and overall, everything was looking great. Well, that's the thing. It was just expectations. Mizzou's been terrible this year, and I don't even know if terrible is the right word to describe it. They've been awful. So far, through 5 weeks of college football, Missouri is 2-3. Oh, that may not be too bad, Scott. Well, you gotta look at the results. They barely squeaked by Central Michigan, they lost on the road to Kentucky, beat a bad Southeastern Missouri State team at home, then lost on the road to Boston College, and at home to Tennessee. Well, Scott, you could also argue that Kentucky is undefeated, Boston College is nearly undefeated, and Tennessee is a decent program. Well, it was the way they lost. In today's video, I want to talk about the disaster that has been Missouri football in 2021, what has gone wrong for them so far, my thoughts, and how they can improve moving forwards. Before we get into that, nearly 80% of you guys are not subscribed to the channel, and be sure to change that by hitting that button, smash that like button for the algorithm, and suggest a topic I can take a look at next. As many of you guys know, Mizzou football is my school, so if you're not subscribed, be sure to hit that button, as I provide a lot of Mizzou content. Now let's get started. Going back to last year, there were no expectations for Missouri. They were seen as the second worst team in the SEC East, and in a 10-game schedule, they were expected to do nothing. Believe it or not, they actually played Alabama somewhat close, but after a drubbing from number 21 Tennessee, all expectations went out the window. They were 0-2. Then they beat number 17 LSU. This was one of the biggest wins in a couple of years for the Tigers, and while LSU did fall off tremendously last year, this was a great momentum shift for the team. After that, they beat Kentucky, and all of a sudden, the team was 2-2. They lost on the road to Florida, which was expected, and then they reeled off 3 straight wins against South Carolina, Vanderbilt, and Arkansas. Because of that, they actually got into the polls and were ranked number 25 in the country. Georgia absolutely killed Mizzou at home, and then to finish the year, they got blown out by Mississippi State. Overall, the team finished at 5-5, and you could argue they didn't beat anyone who was that good. All 5 wins came against teams that were under 500, and they lost to the 3 biggest opponents on their schedule. We saw the emergence of Connor Bazelak at quarterback, as he was named the SEC Freshman of the Year. Larry Roundtree had become the most decorated running back in school history, and Tyler Beatty looked like he was ready to step up in 2021. The defense was questionable, and it would only get tougher as they lost 3 NFL players in Joshua Bledsoe, Tyree Gillespie, and second-round pick to the Chiefs, Nick Bolton. They had the pieces to compete in 2021, but a lot of this would depend on something Mizzou had always done: develop players. There was a lot to figure out, but head coach Elijah Drinkwitz was up to the challenge. Mizzou's 2021 recruiting class was pretty solid. It ranked number 27 in the country and 11th in the SEC. They had signed 4-star recruits Travion Ford, Dominic Lovett, and Tyler Macon. They also pulled out a ton of highly ranked 3-star players and also had a pretty good pickup in the transfer portal. They picked up former top 100 wide receiver Mookie Cooper from Ohio State, 2 all-conference corners in Allie Green and a Caleb Evans from Tulsa, a tackling machine at linebacker in Blaze Aldridge, and a former 4-star offensive lineman from Oklahoma. There were pieces on the team, and things were set for a solid 2021 season. Connor Bazelak was a projected breakout quarterback, Mizzou was a sleeper team in the SEC East, and there were a lot of weapons that everyone was really excited to watch. Many expected them to go between 7-5 and 9-3, and personally myself, I projected them to go 7-5. Before we talk about the 2021 season, there was a major detail that we have to discuss. Defensive coordinator Ryan Walters left to take the job at Illinois, and they'd have to find a new defensive coordinator. Well, who did Elijah Drinkwitz settle on? It was a guy by the name of Steve Wilks. He was actually the head coach for the Arizona Cardinals for 1 year, and he was known as a defensive mastermind. While his scheme didn't work in the NFL, he thought he could teach it to college athletes. It was going to be a high-risk, high-reward kind of scenario, and if it went bad, it was going to be really bad, and that is exactly what has happened. Missouri would open up the season against Central Michigan, and this was one of those games that should not have been close. The Chippewas actually took an early lead, but Mizzou would fight back and make a couple of defensive stands. In this game, we found out that the defense was not very good and that the offense and defensive line were not very strong. Another thing we figured out was that Tyler Beatty was going to be a superstar. So far, he's been the entire offense this year, and in that game, he went off. But many people thought they were just working out the kinks in week 1, and the real test would be week 2 on the road against Kentucky. In a game that I was personally at to watch, Mizzou did not play well. I mean, the defense was absolutely terrible. They could not stop Kentucky the whole night, and I believe they only forced 1 or 2 punts. Kentucky had a couple self-inflicted wounds, including a Chris Rodriguez fumble when he was walking into the end zone. Because of that, Missouri's offense got going enough, and they found a way to make it a 7-point game. They would block a field goal late, and they'd have just under a minute to go to try to go down and tie the game. Bazelak got hurt, and on 4th down, he ended up throwing an incompletion, and Missouri would lose 35-28. This game was fool's gold, as Kentucky should have absolutely blew the rails off of Missouri, and the defense was beyond awful. Tyler Beatty once again put the team on his back, and through week 2, Beatty had the most all-purpose yards of any player in the country, and Mizzou had allowed more rushing yards than any other Power 5 defense. Things were not looking good. Thankfully, they went home and beat up on Southeastern Missouri State, and a lot of young players got a chance to show out. They were 2-1, and if they could just go on the road and beat Boston College, the whole momentum would be different. Boston College superstar quarterback Phil Dracovic was out for the year, so now they're going to be playing against a backup quarterback, and I thought Missouri was going to have a chance to squeak this one out. After a quick score, Boston College once again exposed Missouri's defense and won it by 10 points. Missouri would make a comeback and even take the lead, but BC would score a late touchdown to go up 3. Thankfully, Mizzou would march down the field, and anchored by their kicker, they'd hit a 56-yard to go to overtime. Once again, the defense would be the Achilles heel though, as they just allowed Boston College to score in a couple of plays, and on the first play of Mizzou's possession, Bazelak would throw an interception, and the game was over. For some reason, Boston College stormed the field, but right now Mizzou is 2-2, and they were in danger territory. They still had games against Tennessee, North Texas, Vanderbilt, and South Carolina. They'd be favored in all 4 of those matchups, and if they wanted to get the 6 wins in a bowl game, they could still salvage it all. It didn't quite go that way. Mizzou was favored by 2.5 against the Volunteers, but Tennessee took that personally. Josh Heupel was the offensive coordinator when Drew Lock and Barry Odom were here, and he decided he would stick it to his old school. Tennessee would come out of the gates scoring, as on their first drive they'd quickly go down and score a touchdown. After Missouri would go down the field and kick a 43-yard field goal, it looked like they would still be in the game. Less than a minute later, Tennessee would go down the field and score another touchdown, then they'd get the ball back and score a 92-yard touchdown, and then they'd score another touchdown. By the end of the third quarter, Tennessee was up 28-3, and fans were going towards the exits. This was absolutely embarrassing, but Missouri would get back in the game as Tyler Beatty would have a touchdown. Then Tennessee decided to pour it on even more. They would score 17 more points in the second quarter, as they would take a 42-9 lead at halftime. Outside of a 100-yard kickoff return, Tennessee also dominated in the second half, and they basically stopped trying once the third quarter ended. The final score was 62-24, and Tennessee never punted the ball. The defense was so incredibly bad, the players had seemingly given up, and fans became extremely disappointed. The Steve Wilkes defensive experiment has been an absolute disaster, and there is no reason he should be employed right now. I'm not one of those people who wants to fire all the coaches, as I think in 99% of scenarios, the coaches know more than the fans, and you have to give someone time. But at this point, Mizzou ranks at the bottom of nearly every statistical defensive category. There seems to be a serious effort problem, and the scheme he was trying to bring to college just isn't going to work, so at this point, why not pull the plug? They already fired their defensive line coach earlier this week, and if Wilkes doesn't get it together soon, he's going to be gone. Because of this, the entire outlook of the Missouri season changes, as when you take a look at their schedule, in my opinion, they're only going to win 2 more games. They have North Texas this upcoming weekend, and they also have a road game against Vanderbilt, and I think they're going to win both of those matchups. I no longer think they're going to beat South Carolina, and why would anyone think they have any chance against Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, or Texas A&M? At this point, I believe the record will be 4-8, and things just aren't looking good. To make matters worse, one of Missouri's best young players, Ennis Rakestraw, actually tore his ACL in practice, and this defense just gets younger and more inexperienced. I've seen a lot of Mizzou fans complaining, and the overall buzz that the program had is sort of dying, which is where I get to my main point. I think there's a major problem with Mizzou football. There are many reasons this season has gone bad, as you can obviously blame it on the youth, you can blame it on the defense, and you can blame it on a multitude of other things, but overall, I think Missouri football has a culture problem. Every game I've been to has been pretty boring. I think I've been to about 5 or 6 Mizzou games in the last few years, and every time I go there, there's not that full of a crowd, the energy seemingly is lacking, and there's not a very good game day atmosphere. In order to convince recruits to come play and to win home games, you have to have an electric crowd and a good atmosphere. Missouri has lacked that since Gary Pinkel left, and it just seems no one wants to go to the games. Honestly, I don't blame them either. It seems pretty boring when I go to a game there, and every time they play a decent opponent, they lose. They keep scheduling all these boring games at home against teams like Delaware State and Southeastern Missouri, and who wants to drive out and watch that? When a big-time SEC school comes to town, or even a middle-tier SEC school comes to town, they always seemingly lose. I can't remember the last time they beat a ranked opponent at home when there were fans in attendance, and one thing I've really seen across Mizzou Twitter and across social media is that no one wants to go to a Mizzou home game because they never win or they never show up. There's been a debate back and forth about why Mizzou's attendance has been so low, and the Mizzou boosters, social media people, and coaches have been on the fans about attending games, but every time it seems like there's some momentum, they end up killing it, and they play terrible. I think in order for Mizzou football to take that next step, they have to regain the fan support, they have to win a couple big games at home, and they have to show that the product is worth going out for. Until then, Mizzou football is going to struggle, and that's really all I have to say. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.